Before I get into the latest reports about the situation in Ukraine in this program, I want to go back to discuss a topic that I discussed yesterday in my last video. In this, in that video, I discussed the fact that the United States appears to have joined with Ukraine in supporting an attack on the Kerch Bridge, the Crimean Bridge, with the intention of destroying the bridge at some point in the first weeks of May, at a time when a series of important events, the celebration of Easter, Putin's inauguration, the Russian celebrations of Victory Day on the 9th of May, at some point when one of these events takes place. I also discussed the potential Russian retaliation. And I speculated, and I freely admit that I was speculating, that the Russians might respond by a concerted strikes on the bridges across the Dnieper, which would in effect cut off the Ukrainian army fighting in eastern Ukraine from potential reinforcement, and which would ultimately and all but inevitably bring about its eventual collapse. I said that the United States was perhaps aware of this, and that it might even at some point have come to a private understanding with the Russians that if the Kerch Bridge was not harmed, the Dnieper bridges would not be harmed either. And I said that the fact that the United States might have changed its view and decided that the Kerch or Crimean Bridge ought to be attacked and destroyed anyway was an indicator of the ruthless calculus that the current administration in Washington is bringing to all matters Ukrainian. Well, I think I've just now seen some further confirmation of the extent of the ruthlessness of this calculus on the part of the current US administration. I've discussed, I think, in the last two programs, how it appears that it is the United States that has been heavily lobbying Ukraine, in fact pressuring Ukraine to pass the mobilization law, which would result in Ukraine recruiting 25-year-old men in Ukraine to join the Ukrainian army to fight and in many cases die or be severely wounded in what is increasingly becoming a losing war against Russia. Now, I said that prior to reading an article which I have now seen in the Washington Post, in which the Washington Post informs us that the United States knows perfectly well that the casualty figures that President Zelensky has been floating for Ukrainian casualties, specifically his recent claim that Ukraine has lost only 31,000 killed over the course of this war, that information being provided by Zelensky is untrue. It is, in other words, a lie, and that Zelensky is lying about Ukrainian casualties because he does not want to demoralize Ukrainians and motivate them against wishing to join the Ukrainian army, where they might be thrown into the battle and face likely death. So, in other words, the United States, the Biden administration, is pressuring Ukraine to step up its mobilization efforts, even and at the same time as it knows that Ukraine is providing false information about the true extent of its military fatalities. I have to say that words fail me to express my feelings about this. The cynicism here, the cynicism on display here, leaves me speechless. The United States knows that Ukrainian casualties are higher, probably, in fact, definitely, much higher than Ukraine is admitting. And nonetheless, despite that, it is bullying Ukraine to call up more and more of its young men so that they can be thrown into the battle, and be slaughtered. Now, if that is not ruthless, I don't know what meaning the word ruthless has. Just saying. Anyway, let's move on and let's discuss instead what is actually going on the battlefield in Ukraine, and then let's look at the possible responses from the West to what I noticed even Reuters this morning was admitting is a deteriorating military situation on the battlefronts. By the way, Reuters is doing that on the basis of those comments of General Syrski's that I have discussed in the past. I think that General Syrsky has made further comments. He's talked about how the situation is looking bad in the Marinka and Avdiivka sectors, that the Russians are advancing in these places. He seems to be saying that only 4 brigades of the Russian army are involved, if I've understood this correctly, which actually cannot be true. It is inconceivable that this amount of damage to the Ukrainian army is being done by just 4 Russian brigades. If that is indeed what General Syrsky is saying, we see that yet again the Ukrainians are giving false information in order to play down the extent of the crisis that they are facing on the battlefronts, even as they admit the fact of that crisis. Anyway, let's talk about the situation on the battlefronts. Now, this morning, the Russian Defense Ministry, following its practice of announcing the capture of one village at a time, even as those villages have all been captured together, and in some cases some time ago. Anyway, the Russian Defense Ministry has now confirmed the capture of the village of Semenyovka, which lies immediately south of Berdychi. So far, it has said nothing about the situation in Ocheretino or Solovyova or Berdychi, but it has now admitted the fall of Semenyovka. Now, bear in mind that Semenyovka is close to that area where we were getting reports some days ago that a Ukrainian unit, perhaps full battalion strength, was in the process of surrendering, and where War Gonzo, one of the major Russian reporting channels, told us that yesterday that a Ukrainian unit had indeed surrendered rather. So it looks as if the situation in Semenyovka has been brought fully under Russian control, and all Ukrainian reports are now combining in admitting that Berdychi itself has also been lost. When I say all Ukrainian reports, I include in that General Syrsky himself. He is talking about how the Ukrainians are now pulling back and trying to establish new positions, more defendable positions, as he puts it, west of Berdychi, which is in effect an admission that Berdychi has now indeed been captured by the Russians. Now, we'll see which village the Russians announce that they have captured tomorrow. It could be Solovyovo, it could be Berdychi, it could be Ocheretino. But on the topic of Ocheretino, we apparently now have photographic evidence confirming the presence of Russian troops in the northern part of Ocheretino, which strongly suggests that the various reports that have been circulating now for several days about full Russian control of Ocheretino are true. So anyway, that's the information about Ocheretino at the moment. Now, yesterday I saw a report, I think I saw it on Slavyangrad, that the Ukrainians are trying to gather together a force in the village of Arkhangelskoye, which is located to the northeast of Ocheretino. And the purpose of this force supposedly is to counterattack and try to recapture Ocheretino. Now, at some level, it probably makes sense for the Ukrainians to do that. Ocheretino is such an important position that it would be logical for the Ukrainians, if they had the force necessary, to try to recapture it. I have to say that for the Ukrainians to succeed in recapturing Ocheretino now would be so much against the trend of events over the last few weeks that I would have said that it was all but inconceivable. But it may be that it is the concentration of these Ukrainian forces in Arkhangelskoye which explains why the Russian Defense Ministry is being slow in confirming that Ocheretino has indeed been captured. Just saying. Now, there is another possible reason why the Ukrainians are concentrating troops in Arkhangelskoye, and that is that the Russians are said to be pressing very hard in the villages of Novokalinovo and Keramik, which they have been attacking for some days. The Russians, a couple of days ago, advanced up the H20 highway to the east of Keramik and Novokalinovo, and now they have been, for some days also, advancing in both of these villages. In fact, there were reports a few days ago that Keramik has been entirely captured by the Russians, and some of these reports, by the way, came from Ukrainian sources as well. Most reporters and commentators now believe that there is in fact still fighting going on in Keramik, though that Special Forces unit, the White Wolves, that a Ukrainian Special Forces unit, the White Wolves, that I talked about in one of my recent videos, which had supposedly been trapped by the Russians in Keramik, has apparently been destroyed. That's what the reports claim. I'm not sure what destroyed means, whether it means that they've all been killed, or whether they surrendered, or whether they've been captured. But anyway, that's what I've heard. Anyway, it could be that there is still fighting going on in Keramik, or it could be that this village has been captured. But one way or the other, the Russians are pushing hard on these two villages. And I said yesterday that there were reports that there were forces of around 2 Ukrainian brigades located in this salient between Ocheretino to the west and Keramik and Novokalinovo to the east, and that there was a real risk that these 2 brigades, apparently totaling around 3,500 men, might find themselves trapped and encircled. Now, the escape route for these troops is through Arkhangelskaya. And given that the Russians are also reported to be attacking Arkhangelskaya, well, it's understandable then that the Ukrainians would be rushing reinforcements to Arkhangelskoye. Maybe the plan is not so much to attack Ocheretino, but rather to keep Arkhangelskoye under Ukrainian control, at least until these Ukrainian troops in Novokalinovo, Keramik, and in this salient are able to withdraw and pull back through Arkhangelskoye to whatever new defense lines the Ukrainians intend to set up in this area. So perhaps with all this fighting going on in Novokalinovo and Keramik, the Russians are being careful, the Russian Defense Ministry is being careful, and they're waiting for the fighting in Novokalinovo and Keramik to end and for these villages also to pass fully under their control, and perhaps also for Arkhangelskoye to pass under their control before they finally confirm officially that which virtually everybody now knows, which is that Ocheretino is under their control. Now, the Russians, as I said, have been pushing towards Arkhangelskoye, who reports this morning, very astonishing reports, that the Russians have also been advancing up the T0511 road to the west, and also perhaps across certain fields towards a village called Novo Alexandrovka, and that they're now close to that village. That would point to a potential Russian advance westwards, ultimately towards Pokrovsk. But of course, to reiterate again, if the Russians capture Novokalinovo and Keramik, they have another option, which is to advance north up the H20 highway and also to start taking steps to capture villages to the east of this highway. Now, these include another village called Novobakhmutivka. This should not be confused with the village of Novobakhmutivka, which is south of Ocheretino and which the Russians have just captured. Anyway, this is a bigger village, a much bigger village, called Novobakhmutivka. The Russians could seek to capture that village, also another village north of this Novobakhmutivka called Alexandropol. Then there's another village called Pantelimovka, another village still, Valentinovka, and eventually a village called Sukha Balka. Now, if the Russians are able to advance and along the road, the H20 road, and are able to capture all of these places that I've just named and move on further up the road beyond Sukha Balka, then they have in effect cut off Ukrainian troops in the area to the west of the town of Gorlovka, which the Russians, by the way, have had control of. Well, the Donetsk People's Republic has had control of since 2014. Anyway, they can start to cut off Ukrainian troops in the settlement known as New York and the town of Toretsk. And they would then be also in a very strong position, ultimately to move still further to the north until eventually they come to the northwestern spur of the H20 highway, which brings them to Konstantinovka, to the rear of Ukrainian positions in Chasiv Yar. So maybe we are looking at two simultaneous Russian advances, one along one road to the west towards Pokrovsk, another perhaps north and then east towards Konstantinovka, potentially also encircling Ukrainian troops west of Gorlovka in New York and Toretsk. Either of these advances would be a disaster for the Ukrainians. If both take place and if both are successful, well, the situation for the Ukrainians would be completely catastrophic, and that would be an understatement. We would be looking at the total collapse of Ukrainian defenses in Donbass. We're going to turn to that shortly. Now, that's the situation on the Ocheretino front lines. As I said, reports that the Russians are making significant advances around Ocheretino, but we're also getting further reports that the Russians, having now captured Berdychi, are again advancing westwards. There are apparently confirmed reports that they have entered a village, another village called Novopokrovskoye. There is apparently, and this has been probably true for some time, fighting going on within Umanske. And lastly, there has been an accumulation of reports, including from Ukrainian sources, that the village of Netailovo, west of Pervomaisky, on the southern part of this line, is now either 30% under Russian control, or there are some reports that say that Ukrainian defenses in Netailovo have completely collapsed, and that this entire village is coming under Russian control as well. Now, that might be premature. Let me stress again, at the moment, the more reliable reports suggest that whilst a significant part of this village has been captured, the Russians have not yet captured the whole of it. So, however, it's clear that the line to the west of Avdiivka, probably the one that Syrskyi is talking about, the one that goes through Umanske, Yasnobrodovka, and Netailovo, with the loss of Ocheretino, is also in the process of collapse. Anyway, we shall see. But one way or the other, with reports that the Russians are reinforcing in this area, one can sense the crisis that is developing. The fact that Syrskyi is feeling obliged to make these sort of statements demonstrates how bad for the Ukrainians this whole situation in the Avdiivka area has become, and the fact that he appears to feel that he needs to admit that the Ukrainians are being forced to retreat, and to provide some reassurance that some kind of front lines, some kind of stable front lines will be created, because it's clear at the moment that that is not the case. By the way, there's been a lot of talk in recent weeks about Ukraine creating fortified lines. So far, at least in this part of the battlefronts, in the areas around Avdiivka and Ocheretino, There is really no sign of this. Most of the fighting continues to take place in villages and across open fields, where the Russians, who now seem to have strong superiority in armor, tanks, armored vehicles, and that sort of thing, are at a distinct advantage, especially given that they also control the sky, so that they're able to shell and bomb and drone attack Ukrainian forces pretty much wherever they find them. Anyway, that's the situation on the Avdiivka front lines. It's the most important part of the battle. There's, as I said, fighting going on in other places. The most important other place at the moment is Krasnogorovka. There's reports that the Russians have now reached some kind of roundabout or crossroads within Krasnogorovka. Again, it seems to me that as has just happened in Berdychi, the Ukrainians are clinging on to their positions in Krasnogorovka for too long. We've seen this, as I said, this story repeat itself time after time, but it seems that Zelensky and Syrskyi as well are not willing to countenance a withdrawal from Krasnogorovka, even though the Russians are advancing within the town itself and are located to the north and west of it, with Pervomaisky captured and likely Netalevo captured also before very long. So anyway, a major operational crisis, a developing operational crisis, one that is getting worse for the Ukrainians every day, indeed by the hour. It could be that the Ukrainians may be thinking of some kind of counterattack to try to recapture Ocheretino. I suspect that if they do, all that will happen is that they will suffer still more losses. And we can see Ukrainian positions in the meantime fall, tumble one by one like a row of dominoes in what is arguably the most important area of the entire front line. Now, there's also reports that the Russians have been more active in the Bakhmut area, that they've been improving, as they like to say, their positions around Chasiv Yar. Certainly, they continue to bomb Chasiv Yar intensively, and there are said to be large numbers of Russian troops concentrated in this area. But there's been few reports about this for the moment. What we have heard is that the village of Kisyovka in the Kupiansk area, which the Russians attacked a couple of days ago, supposedly that village has been captured by the Russians. Again, I've seen no confirmation of this. There's talk that the Russians have now entered the adjoining village of Katlerovka. Again, I've seen no evidence of this. But anyway, there is a general consensus that the Russians are on the move in this area as well. A couple of days ago, we got claims that the Russians had captured the village of Makeyevka in the Tierny area. I should say that I've seen no evidence yet of that either. But anyway, we are getting these reports, all of which do appear to show that the Russian pressure on these front lines in the north remains strong. And of course, we still have the mystery, the uncertainty about what the Russians might be planning to do in Kharkiv region with the group of forces north, led apparently by General Lapin, that they have recently put together. And with the speculation from people like Kirill Budanov that the Russians might be planning some major offensive in late May, early June. Most assume that will be in the Kharkiv area. Most assume that will be against the city of Kharkiv itself. As I said, we have no word of that from any official Russian source. We're just going to have to wait and see what happens. But anyway, the pressure remains strong, and west of Avdiivka, in the Ocheretino-Avdiivka area, we seem to be witnessing a gathering collapse. Now, a Swiss magazine called Blick has now undertaken a series of interviews with various Ukrainian soldiers and military officers. I should say that I have not read this piece in Blick myself. I'm getting the information about it at second hand. But what I have read is that the people that Blick has spoken to, the Ukrainian military that Blick has spoken to, are extremely angry and very bitter about the situation. Many of them are still very angry about the dismissal of General Zaluzhny by President Zelensky some weeks ago, and his replacement by General Syrskyi, who commands little confidence amongst the Ukrainian troops on the ground, and who is blamed for the over-hasty disbandment of 3 brigades. These would be the 25th, 67th, and 115th Brigade, one assumes, and for giving orders that are unrealistic or even irrational, demanding that Ukrainian units that are inadequately armed and trained be thrown into the battle before they're ready. So there's a lot of that, but overall, the most important takeaway from this article, as I understand it, is that despite the aid from the United States that was announced following the vote in Congress, despite the aid from the United States, the Ukrainian soldiers interviewed by Blick appear to agree that the war is being lost, that the Russians are getting stronger, and they are claiming that, or rather they are saying, that the Russians are likely to be in complete control of Donbass by the end of October. That would mean that the Russians will capture Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka, and Pokrovsk, and all of these places. And, well, there's talk that with Donbass having passed entirely under Russian control, at that point, Ukraine might be forced to sue for peace and to seek a ceasefire. I have to say that if Donbass is captured by the Russians in that way, then I'm not sure why the Russians would agree to simply sit down and negotiate and agree a ceasefire. The most important Ukrainian positions will have been destroyed and captured. Perhaps the greater part of the Ukrainian army will have been defeated, and the way will be open for the Russians to advance west towards the Dnieper River, towards Zaporozhye and Dnipro, and the Russians are already, in some respects now, very close to those two cities. They're probably just about an hour's drive, I'm guessing, from Zaporozhye, from the city of Zaporozhye. If one is looking at some of the frontline positions that the Russians already hold in Zaporozhye region. So I would have thought that if the whole of Donbass were to fall in that way, the Russians would probably want to press home their advantage. And if we go back to what Putin's spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, has been saying, he said, yes, the Russians are indeed prepared to talk. They're prepared to discuss what I've referred to as Istanbul Plus. But he has said that the Russians will not agree to a ceasefire until there is a final agreement confirmed by the Ukrainian side. And that agreement, which would certainly involve, at the very least, the cession of the four regions in their entirety to Russia, plus a commitment for Ukraine's neutrality, and agreements also covering things like the status of Russian speakers in Ukraine and the process of demilitarization and denazification and all of that. Well, all of that might be very difficult even for a Ukrainian government that has lost Donbass and which is facing the Russian army on the Dnieper to agree to. So anyway, Blick is giving a very pessimistic view about the overall situation, and apparently it is getting this information directly from Ukrainian sources. Now, there's been another article in the Spanish newspaper, El País, which to some extent says much the same thing. And it's coming from, again, interviews with Ukrainian officers, and they're saying that not only is the Russian army advancing and the funding from the West, the support from the West, insufficient, but the Russians are getting better all the time as they've gained experience and gained understanding of how to wage the war, as their military industrial production accelerates and increases, as their army becomes more numerous, as their officers and commanders have gained experience. The Russian army on the battlefronts is continuing to improve all the time. Now, I am not the best person to comment about tactics or about the evolution of warfare, but I think one can actually start to see some signs of that. There's been all this discussion recently, for example, about turtle tanks. These are tanks, or in fact, in some cases, armored vehicles, which have had all kinds of metal shields bolted on them, which do appear to provide protection against drones, FPV drones, and things like that. There are problems. Apparently, the gun can't now be turned in its turret, so we're no longer looking, in effect, at a tank. We're looking rather at a kind of assault gun. But it does seem that these turtle tanks, which probably exist in no more than a few, probably, 5 or 6 at most. But anyway, these turtle tanks have been apparently effective in enabling Russian armored columns to advance against the problems created by FPV drones. The turtle tanks are almost certainly an improvisation by Russian soldiers in the field. They're testimony to the very extensive technical skills that you will find in Russia. There's a large pool of people there, including people who will have joined the army, who have the kind of mechanical knowledge and the ability to improvise in this way. But as I said, they're almost certainly a local adaptation to the problem created by the FPV drones. Nonetheless, someone in the Russian chain of command has had the imagination to authorize these developments and to encourage them and to encourage their use. So that again suggests a degree of flexibility within the Russian command structure. But one is seeing all sorts of things happen in all sorts of ways, and particularly in drone warfare. And I'm going to say this, I try to follow Western military commentary, both about the war and about war in general. It's not an easy task for me to do because this is well outside my own area of expertise. But it does seem to me as if the Russians are now in the process of developing drones, aerial and ground drones, on a scale that no Western army is remotely matching, and that they're bringing to it a huge degree flair and imagination in the way that they're doing it. So instead of the big Reaper and Predator drones, which it's clear would not survive in the kind of battlefield conditions that we're seeing, we see lots of different types of small drones. There was the Lancet drones that we were hearing so much about last year. They're still very busy. They're doing all the same levels of destruction that they were doing last year, but there are all sorts of other sorts of drones. There's work apparently on AI drones. They're not just kamikaze drones. Apparently, they're drones that are going to act as bodyguards for armored columns, flying above the armored columns, protecting them from attack by other drones, all that kind of thing. And the jamming technologies have also developed to extraordinary levels of sophistication as well. And then, of course, there's the simple tactical lessons that have also been learned. Here, I suspect much of the breakthrough was achieved by the Wagner forces in Bakhmut, but it's been striking to see the difference between the incredibly tough fighting in Bakhmut and the speed with which the Russians capture places like Avdiivka and Ocheretino. They seem to have worked out some kind of system for conducting urban warfare, which is clearly working very effectively. Anyway, that now brings me back to that topic I discussed yesterday, which is the potential for the Russians to destroy the Dnieper bridges. Now, I have had, again, an incredibly helpful email from one of the people who follow these programs, who has repeatedly given me a huge amount of assistance, and I want to make it clear how grateful I am to him. Anyway, he's explained a number of things to me. Firstly, he has suggested that there was consideration given in Russia to the destruction of the Dnieper bridges in the summer of 2022. This is not so much to isolate Ukrainian forces on the east bank of the river. This took place at a time when the Russians were retreating and consolidating. They were withdrawn first from Kiev, and then they retreated from Kharkiv, and then, of course, they retreated from Kherson region on the west bank of the Dnieper. The Russians were thinking about consolidating at that time and retreating at that time, and it was thought that maybe if they destroyed the bridges, that would make it easier for them to carry out this defense without interruption. But then the plan changed. General Surovikin apparently came in and took charge, and the decision was made, largely apparently by him, to build up this great line of fortifications that we've seen operate so successfully on the battlefronts. And the Ukrainians also were pinned down by the long battle for Bakhmut, and over the course of the autumn and winter and spring of 2022 and 2023, the plan changed, and it was decided that it would not be a good idea to destroy the Dnieper bridges, that there was no urgent need to destroy the Dnieper bridges, that in fact it served the Russian interest to allow the Ukrainians to transfer their army to the east bank of the Dnieper and to conduct their disastrous summer offensive, because that would be the most efficient way whereby the Russians could cause that Ukrainian army the greatest possible level of attrition. And of course, it is the devastation of that army, the Ukrainian army, over the series of the last few months, which has now put the Russians in the strong position that they are. Whereas, if the Dnieper bridges had been destroyed in, say, the summer of 2022, the Russians today would be facing a much stronger Ukrainian army on the West Bank, guarding the West Bank of the Dnieper, than they would be doing now. And that all makes sense to me, and it is a completely believable reconstruction of Russian thinking. Note that it does not involve any understanding with the Americans about a tacit agreement that the Russians won't go after the Dnieper bridges if the Kerch Bridge itself is not attacked or destroyed. Though, by the way, the one does not exclude the other. But anyway, it's nonetheless a reconstruction. The most important point in this email, as far as I'm concerned, is that this person, I must be again very careful not to disclose who he is, this person has also provided me with very detailed and, I think here, incontrovertible information about whether or not the Russians do possess the ability to destroy the Dnieper bridges. And the long and the short of it is that they do, that in fact a strike by a single Kinjal missile on any one of these bridges would do massive destruction and would probably destroy it. So the Russians have the ability, should they choose to do it, to destroy the Dnieper bridges. And it seems to me that we are probably coming closer to the point when the Russians might decide that it is in their interest to do just that. Now, note that this person is only speaking about the Kinjal missile, the KH-22 missile, massive thing, probably could do even more damage to a bridge, and I'm not even discussing the aerial bombs. The Russians have the capability to destroy the Dnieper bridges. We've seen multiple examples of how precise the strikes by Russian missiles are. There is no reason to doubt that they would be able to target successfully and hit the bridges as well. And with the Ukrainian air defense system now catastrophically depleted, there is nothing the Ukrainians could do to stop the Russians from doing it. Now, I am not saying that the Russians are going to attack the Dnieper bridges. I don't know. I want to stress again, what their plans are. But as I've said in the past, I, for one, if the war is going to be pressed on forward by the Russians, I, for one, have to say that it looks to me like a very strong possibility indeed, with the Russians on the offensive east of the Dnieper, likely to deal a knockout blow to the Ukrainians east of the Dnieper very before long. It seems to me that the Russians might have a strong incentive to destroy the bridges and cut the Ukrainians off before they can withdraw their army to the West Bank. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about this. Let's now turn to potential Western reactions. It's been fascinating to see how over the last couple of days, as it's all sunk in, that the $61 billion package is not going to reverse the situation. The mood in the West, which had been given a short uplift, is now lowering again. And we come back, therefore, to that perennial topic, which comes up again time after time, which is how to sustain the war. How does the West keep the war going? Well, in terms of defense production, it is extremely difficult. The West is perhaps gradually going to increase its weapons production, but it is clear that the Russians are, for the moment at least, increasing their weapons production faster than the West is able to do, and that the volumes of what they're producing already exceeds by orders of magnitude that which the West is currently producing and can supply to Ukraine. But there's the shortage of manpower also, and I've discussed that as well. In many programs, we've talked about the unwillingness of Ukrainian troops to serve in the Ukrainian men to serve in the Ukrainian army, the shortages of manpower, the increasingly desperate attempt to mobilize soldiers, the attempts to put pressure on Ukrainian men who have fled the country to Europe to come back to Ukraine, to make them come back to Ukraine so that they can be enlisted and thrown into the battle from there. However that is done, it is not going to, whatever is done, difficult to see that problem ever being resolved. There's also the problem of funding and concerns about maintaining funding levels for the conflict in Ukraine. And here I'm going to suggest that it's not just maintaining funding levels whilst the conflict goes on, it is maintaining funding levels generally, even past the conflict. What I mean by that is that even if the Russians win, force the Ukrainians to come to terms, agree some kind of treaty with the Ukrainians, perhaps with the new Ukrainian government, which the Western powers won't recognize, the United States, or at least, and European governments are unlikely to be happy with that. There's a very, very troubled article in the National Interest today, which says that the United States has outlined no plan for victory in Ukraine. Its only strategy seems to be to keep the war going indefinitely in order to tie down and ultimately weaken Russia. And, well, one senses that that might continue to be the strategy after the war is ultimately lost. And the article says, here I think it might be a little complacent, that if the Russians win, well, it might be a psychological blow for the West, but the Americans can probably confidently calculate that it will not change the political orientation in Europe. Most of the European states will continue to remain loyal to their alliance with the United States. So, if one follows the reasoning of that further, then it's important to keep the conflict in Ukraine going pretty much indefinitely, even if the war itself, the fighting in other words, has ended because the Russians have won. And of course, there's all kinds of ways you can do that. You can create an alternative government, Ukrainian government in the West, put together from Ukrainian politicians and officials who have fled to the West. You can refuse to recognize the government that whatever Ukrainian government has actually signed any peace agreement with the Russians. Perhaps if the Russians actually cross the Dnieper and occupy the whole of Ukraine, well, you can do the same thing. You can create a Ukrainian government in exile, lobby for that government to retain Ukraine's seat in the General Assembly in the United Nations, recognize that government as Ukraine's legitimate government, and keep the conflict going in that way, whilst putting psychological and economic pressure on the Russians indefinitely. Now, that of course looks beyond the war, looks beyond the fighting. I'm not saying that's the immediate plan. I think the immediate plan remains to try to retain control of at least Ukraine west of the Dnieper. But the point I'm making is that even if that plan, which isn't really a plan, is unsuccessful, then the conflict can continue even after the war itself ends. This is not, by the way, a unique situation in world affairs. If we go to the situation in the Middle East, there have been long periods in the Arab-Israeli conflict and the Palestinian-Israeli conflict when there has been relative quiet, but the conflict has always been there and has always continued. And that is what you might want to do with the situation in Ukraine. But you will need funding to do that. And you will also need, if you're the Biden administration, to tie the hands of any future president, particularly if that president turns out to be Donald Trump, to prevent him from changing that policy, because changing the policy, of course, would defeat the entire object of the whole exercise. And I think that explains some of the things that we're now seeing appear, all the ideas that are now appearing. President Zelensky is now talking about a 10-year security agreement with the United States. A 10-year security agreement would, of course, cover the period of any possible future Trump administration. If the security agreement takes the form of a security treaty of some kind, it would presumably be ratified by the Senate There's probably a majority in the Senate to do that, judging on the votes that we saw 10 days ago. Anyway, probably the administration will not want to go that far. But anyway, a security agreement agreed by the administration and on behalf of the United States. And the Zelensky government might be very politically difficult for a future president to walk away from it. And of course, if Zelensky himself is overthrown, if a new government steps in and commits to peace with Russia and agrees a treaty with Russia, or if Russia captures Ukraine, you don't recognize the political changes, you support a government in exile, and you say that government in exile remains the government with which you have that security agreement. Something like that, by the way, has happened for 30 years after the Chinese Communist Party's victory in the Chinese Civil War. The United States continued to recognize the former government of China, which had established itself with American protection in Taiwan, as the true and legitimate government of China. And of course, the US's agreements with that government remained in effect. So you do something like that, but you still need funding for it. And you might say to yourself, well, further funding from Congress might be increasingly difficult to obtain. Of course, if there's a new government, if there's a new president who wants to change the policy, he might not be keen to ask for Congress for further funding. But given the amount of opposition there's already been in Congress to funding for Ukraine, and importantly in the House of Representatives, even some Democrats seemed unhappy. Well, you have to find a steady funding source some other way. And there's been a very interesting article today in Reuters by Hugo Dixon, which suggests the possible way. And surprise to surprise, it will be done by seizing Russia's assets, its frozen assets. And the article again comes back to the loan stroke reparations idea. The idea is that Ukraine is given a loan by the Western powers, the G7, in the amount, presumably, of the Russian frozen assets. The loan is then set off against reparations payments to be paid by the Russians in light of their aggression against Ukraine. If the Russians refuse to pay the reparations, which of course they will, then the frozen assets will be seized to repay the loan. It's a complicated device, basically to seize the Russian assets, pretending that it's reparations, that it's to pay reparations, even though the reparations have never been agreed by the Russians. Now, I have already discussed this scheme, but I guess that it is in fact the scheme that the British and American governments are promoting, and I suspect they've been doing this for several months now. It is legally absurd. In fact, in my opinion, in legal terms, it is weaker than a straightforward step to confiscate the assets, because it admits that the assets that are being seized in this roundabout way are actually Russian. And, well, given that Russia would not have agreed to pay Ukraine reparations, there is no legal basis under this scheme whereby those assets can be seized in the way that is being suggested. But we have repeatedly seen that the administration, the US Biden administration and its hardline allies in Europe have never let little things like international law, sovereign immunity, the law of contract, anything like that stand in the way of what they want to do. Now, a couple of days ago, the Wall Street Journal said that Germany remains adamantly opposed to this whole scheme. The Germans, of course, are no doubt aware of the extreme discomfort of the Bundesbank, the European central banks, the European banking industry as a whole, of Euroclear, and of the European Central Bank about this whole idea of seizing the Russian assets. They know that the financial community in Europe strongly opposes this whole idea, which they recognize as illegal and which they also recognize as undermining the long-term credibility of the financial system within the Eurozone. So undoubtedly the Germans have that concern. But we're also told that the Germans are very unhappy about this idea for another reason. And that is that they don't like the way in which this loan is now being justified as this scheme is being set up as a loan secured against future reparation payments that Russia will one day supposedly be expected to pay, even if it has never agreed to it. And the reason is, of course, that Germany, with its terrible history, lives in constant fear of others coming forward and demanding that it pay reparations. The Germans have made various agreements at various times with various countries on reparations payments, but they wanted to treat for some time now this whole topic as closed, and they don't want it to be reopened. And I am going to make a guess that I think this is a general feeling right across the German political and financial and business class. This whole idea of basing this asset seizure against reparations, upon reparations, is one that is going to ring very loud alarm bells in Berlin. However, I still think that this is what eventually is going to happen. The entire story of this crisis in Ukraine is of the Anglo-Americans, the Americans and the British, coming up with bad ideas, disconnecting Russian banks from SWIFT, freezing Russian central bank reserves, sending ever more advanced weapon systems to Ukraine, launching attacks deep inside Russian territory, doing things which are illegal and which they have repeatedly said they will not do, and of then doing them. And this whole story has also been continuously framed with opposition from Germany to all of these steps. The Germans expressed opposition to the plan to expel Russian banks from SWIFT. They were not keen on the seizure of the Russian central bank reserves, or rather the freezing of the reserves. They opposed the cutting off of oil and gas supplies to Europe. They resisted the supply of heavy weapons to Ukraine. They opposed strikes deep into Russia. But in the end, they have agreed to every one. Why suppose that on this issue they won't agree in the end also? It would be disastrous, potentially, for the Eurozone and specifically for Germany to go down this route. But, well, why weren't all the other things disastrous also? And yet the Germans, nonetheless, in the end, went along with all of them. Now, to be very clear, if these $300 billion of Russian assets that are supposed to be frozen are indeed seized, even in this roundabout way, it is not going to change the outcome of the war. As Brian Berdychi has absolutely correctly said, you can have as much money as you want, but if you can't buy the weapons because the weapons don't exist, then the money won't help you win the war. J.D. Vance has just made the same point. So it's not going to change the outcome of the war. But if your intention is not any longer, perhaps, to win the war, but rather to keep the conflict going indefinitely, to keep Russia and Europe at odds indefinitely with each other, then what better way to do it than this? And of course, if along the way damage is done to the credibility of the Euro system and to the European economies, well, I have to say it, the Biden administration and the president himself have never shown themselves too concerned about that. Well, there it is. I don't know how soon this will happen. It might happen as soon as the next G7 summit meeting. We shall see. It might take longer, but one way or another, I think it is coming. Again, it is not a sign of the success of the West's efforts to support Ukraine against Russia. On the contrary, it is a testament to their failure, to the failure of the West to defeat the Russians on the battlefield, or break their economy, or trigger a political crisis in Moscow, or alienate Putin from the so-called oligarchs, or achieve any one of those things. What we see is endless escalation, resort to ever more extreme measures, the less successful Western policy is, and that is what this would be. In fact, it would cap it all. It would cap a whole series of disastrous decisions by Western governments, which have been the hallmark of this entire affair ever since the Maidan crisis of 2013, and arguably even beyond that. But there it is. Nothing apparently can cause the train to stop or slow, let alone change course, especially with the current president at the helm, given the visceral feelings he appears to have about this matter. Now, just to get a sense of how bad, in a way, things have become in respect of European decision-making, take an article that has appeared today in The Guardian by the former British Prime Minister Gordon Brown. Now, Gordon Brown is far from a universally popular figure in Britain. He has any number of critics. But even most of his enemies would say that he has some understanding of economics. He was, after all, Chancellor of the Exchequer for, well, the greater part of 10 years. And, well, there's different views about how well he did, but inevitably, if you're going to be finance minister of Britain for such a long period of time, you will develop some understanding of economic policy and of how economies work. By the way, and for the record, I personally rate Brown rather more highly than some of his detractors do. And I certainly think that he has more than sufficient technical knowledge and competence to be able to discuss economic matters intelligently. Anyway, he's written a long article today in The Guardian lamenting the fact that there's a hard right tidal wave about to hit Europe and it will only make the economic crisis worse. That's what the article says. And he then goes on to say that near zero growth has crushed living standards, sending voters to populist demagogues, but they have no solutions to offer. And then he discusses at length the long period of economic stagnation that Europe is now experiencing. And he says that Europe, especially its industrial engine room, Germany, continues to suffer from near zero growth and stagnation in terms of living standards. And having lived through a decade of consistently low growth, the continent is now divided between an optimistic but declining majority who still hold to the expectation that a rising tide lifts all the boats, and the growing and more pessimistic majority who now see life as a zero-sum game. Now, he accepts that there is a major problem of economic stagnation in the West. He talks, as we've just seen, about the problems in Germany in particular. But nowhere in the article does he even mention one of the key reasons why, over the last 2 years, the economic situation in Germany specifically has deteriorated as rapidly as it has. And to get a sense of that deterioration, I saw the PMI manufacturing figures coming out of Germany, and they've now fallen to 42, which suggests a severe further contraction in Germany's once mighty manufacturing and industrial machine, which continues to be the core of its economy. Well, as I said, Gordon Brown doesn't tell us why that's happening. Nowhere in the article will you find any reference to it. And that, of course, is that Germany has lost its access to that stable, steady supply of cheap, reliable gas coming from Russia, which was key to it achieving economic stability and competitiveness. The Germans have come up with all kinds of schemes and plans to get around it. They've gone for liquefied natural gas from the United States. They're quietly buying liquefied natural gas from the Russians as well. They have experimented with all kinds of green technologies. But whatever energy mix they put together, it is still more expensive, much more expensive than the cheap gas from the Russians they were formerly importing. Not just gas, by the way, but coal and oil and all those things too. They've foregone all of it. And yes, of course, other countries that they're competing against don't necessarily import Russian gas and oil, but then either they never have, in, say, the case of Japan, at least not in huge quantities, the kind of quantities that Germany did, or they don't import it in anything like the same quantities because, like in the case of the United States, for example, they are a major energy producer themselves. So that's the single most important reason at the moment why there is an economic crisis in Europe, why European economies are not growing, why living standards are falling, why inflation, by the way, is still rising, why that sense of pessimism has taken hold. But Gordon Brown, who certainly knows this, won't admit it, he won't write about it, he won't discuss it, he certainly won't discuss what happened to Nord Stream 2, to the Nord Stream pipelines, the destruction of the Nord Stream pipelines, and who perhaps destroyed them. There was, by the way, a very interesting and very important debate on this very topic in the UN Security Council the other day. Larry Johnson, who is a regular guest on the Duran and who has a magnificent website, Sonar 21, was invited to speak, to address the Security Council on this very topic. Anyway, the Security Council met to discuss it. The Russians and the Chinese pushed for an investigation, an independent investigation of who destroyed Nord Stream. The three monkeys routine that the Western powers invariably follow came back into effect. They don't hear, they don't see, they don't speak. We see the same from people like Gordon Brown. Don't talk about Nord Stream. Don't talk about the cutting off of Russian gas. Talk about everything else, about the need to improve green technologies and that kind of thing, to engage in more deficit spending, all that sort of thing. But don't discuss the single thing that is currently dragging the European economies most. So, in this world where simple, overwhelming realities cannot be discussed, is it surprising if eventually the train continues to trundle along the same lines and we see more disastrous decisions made, like the seizing of these Russian assets, which every expert that I know of who could be considered in any way authoritative or reputable has come forward and said would be a terrible mistake. Well, there we are. So it seems to me the situation is Russians will continue the war. They will continue to advance. The situation on the front lines for Ukraine continues to go from bad to worse. Ukrainian losses remain impossibly high. The United States is aware of that fact, as I discussed at the outset of this program. And it seems that whatever happens on the battle lines, even if Ukraine goes under, and Ukrainian soldiers are now basically saying that by October, the Battle of Donbass will finally be lost. And to be clear, that is the decisive battle in the war. Well, even if Ukraine goes under, go ahead, confiscate Russian assets, disregard all the damage that will do to Europe's credibility as a financial center and financial haven, accept the loss in order to keep a conflict in Europe still ongoing, and don't discuss whether that is a good idea or what the implications of that would be, just as you don't want to talk about the economic losses from the loss of Russian gas, and you don't want to discuss who it was who destroyed Nord Stream. Well, in the West, we have often done terrible things. And it has to be said, it's not the first time in our history that we are doing them. But usually we talked about them, we had discussions, sometimes more, sometimes less, but discussions did take place. In 19th century Britain, for example, as the empire expanded, often in very ruthless ways, you found people who stood up and criticized it, including in the House of Commons. I've never known a time in the modern history of the democratic West, as it still calls itself, when policies have been followed which are so nihilistic and so destructive and so cynical, as I said at the outset of this program, but which take place with so little discussion. Well, that's my program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop, where you'll find all sorts of amazing things, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, please remember, if you've liked this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.